Hello everyone. Let me begin by asking you all a thought-provoking question. Do you believe that human sexuality can be used as a path to reach our ultimate spiritual nature? Can it be a gateway to something divine? Take a moment to reflect on that. In today's world, we often find ourselves wondering about the deeper meaning of our existence, and sometimes we may even consider if something as personal and intimate as our sexuality can lead us to a higher spiritual plane. Now let's explore this idea. It's easy to think that sexuality might hold a transformative power, capable of opening doors to higher consciousness or spiritual enlightenment. But before we jump to conclusions, we have to ask ourselves, do we really have the discipline and awareness to handle it in that way? Here's an interesting point. Yes, sexuality, like every other aspect of human life, can be seen as a path towards something greater. In fact, every part of our existence, from the smallest atom to the most complex emotions, can serve as a doorway to a higher purpose. But the question remains, are we equipped to walk this path? For most of us, the answer might be no. Why? Because transforming sexual energy into spiritual growth requires an immense amount of discipline, self-control, and conscious effort. Let's take a moment to consider modern life. We live in a world of distractions, social media, entertainment, work pressures, and societal expectations. Sexuality, in particular, is often magnified and exaggerated, presented to us as if it's central to our identity or personal value. But is that true? Should sexuality take up such a large part of our mental and emotional energy? The truth is, sexuality, while important, is just a small part of who we are. Our bodies are naturally designed for reproduction, and sexuality is an instinct meant to ensure the survival of our species. But beyond that, it doesn't need to define us, nor should it consume our lives. The reason it often feels so overwhelming is that our society has distorted its significance. Feelings of guilt, shame, and societal pressure have made it a more complex and burdened aspect of life than it needs to be. The key takeaway here is this: we should treat sexuality as a natural biological function. It's part of our physical existence, like eating or sleeping, and serves a necessary role in the survival of humanity. However, it is not a direct or necessary path to spiritual enlightenment unless we possess extraordinary discipline. Most of us, in our day-to-day lives, simply don't have the focus or the need to turn sexuality into a spiritual process. Think of it this way. Imagine you're hiking through a forest. You come across two paths. One is smooth, clear, and direct, while the other is steep, rocky, and full of obstacles. Both paths might lead you to the same destination, but which one would you choose if you were unprepared or unsure of your abilities? Most people would take the easier, more straightforward path. Sexuality as a spiritual process is like the difficult path. It requires intense preparation and focus, and it's not necessary when there are simpler ways to achieve spiritual growth. In today's fast-paced world, where distractions are plenty, it's easy to misunderstand the role of sexuality. It's often portrayed as a source of power or a way to find fulfillment. However, the reality is much simpler. Sexuality is just one part of our overall existence, a small part at that. Our lives are made up of many other important elements: love, creativity, compassion, intellectual pursuits, and personal growth. When we overemphasize sexuality, we risk losing sight of these other fulfilling aspects of life. It's important to recognize that everyone experiences sexuality differently. For some, it might be a significant part of life, while for others, it's a passing phase. And for most people, it's a natural and moderate part of human existence. Yet, societal norms and pressures often exaggerate its importance, making people feel like they need to conform to certain standards or behaviors. So here's the main message. Don't try to turn sexuality into something it's not. It's a natural part of your biology, and it serves a purpose. But it's not the key to spiritual enlightenment, and for most people, it's not the most significant aspect of their life. There are much easier, more effective ways to grow spiritually through meditation, mindfulness, compassion, and self-awareness. Let's put it into perspective. Eating and sleeping are two other natural, biological functions. We don't spend our lives obsessing over these aspects of our existence, nor do we try to turn them into spiritual processes. We simply accept them for what they are, a necessary part of life that supports our well-being. In the same way, we should view sexuality. It's important, but it's not something that needs to be overthought or overemphasized. We've all seen how societal pressures can distort our understanding of sexuality. People look around, compare themselves to others, and feel inadequate if they don't match up to certain expectations. But here's a liberating truth. You don't need to conform to anyone else's idea of what your sexuality should be. It's yours to define and understand in your own way, at your own pace. If you step back and focus on your own needs, rather than what society tells you, you'll likely find that sexuality plays a much smaller role in your life than you originally thought. So, sexuality is a natural part of our existence. It's there to serve a biological purpose, but it doesn't need to dominate our thoughts, our identity, or our spiritual journey. In fact, there are far simpler, more effective ways to grow spiritually without complicating the process by focusing on sexuality. Accept it for what it is, and focus on the aspects of life that truly bring meaning, joy, and fulfillment. Spiritual growth comes from awareness, mindfulness, and connection to something greater than ourselves, not from trying to turn sexuality into something it was never meant to be. Now that we've explored the idea of sexuality as a natural part of life, rather than a spiritual path, let's dive deeper into a related topic: societal expectations and how they shape our understanding of sexuality. This might sound abstract, but it's actually something we all experience, whether we realize it or not. Society has a powerful influence on the way we view ourselves, especially when it comes to matters like sexuality, identity, and fulfillment. And often, this influence can distort our perception of what we truly need or want. So, let me ask you this. How many of us are living our lives based on what society tells us is right or acceptable, rather than on what we truly feel? Take a moment to think about that. Do you ever feel like you're being pulled in a direction that doesn't necessarily align with your own personal truth, but you go along with it anyway because, well, that's what everyone else seems to be doing? This isn't just limited to sexuality. It happens in all areas of life. Career choices, relationships, even the way we present ourselves to the world. But when it comes to something as intimate and personal as sexuality, the pressure to conform can be especially strong. We live in a world that's filled with expectations. Expectations about how we should look, how we should act, and how we should feel. And sometimes, these expectations can make us feel inadequate if we don't fit the mold. Here's the philosophical idea I want to explore today. True freedom comes when we let go of the need to meet society's standards and instead focus on understanding and accepting ourselves as individuals. In other words, we must break free from the pressure to conform and start living in alignment with our own truths. Let's take a closer look at how this relates to sexuality. From a young age, many of us are taught certain ideas about what sexuality should look like. We're bombarded with images from the media, with cultural norms, and with messages that tell us what's normal or desirable. These societal standards often make us feel like we need to fit into a certain box, that if we're not experiencing sexuality in the same way as others, there's something wrong with us. But here's the truth. There is no universal standard for human experience. Each of us is different. Our needs, desires, and experiences vary greatly from person to person. Yet, instead of embracing this diversity, we often find ourselves caught in a cycle of comparison, looking at others and wondering if we're measuring up. But this cycle leads us away from authenticity. It pushes us to act in ways that don't reflect who we really are. We start to perform for society, instead of living in a way that is true to ourselves. This brings me to the main point. Your experience of sexuality, or any other part of your life, does not need to conform to social standards. You don't need to measure yourself against what others are doing. what they're saying, or how they're living. Your truth is your own, and it's unique to you. Let's think about this philosophically. What is society, really? It's a collection of individuals, each with their own thoughts, feelings, and experiences. Yet, society as a whole tends to create collective norms that are supposed to apply to everyone. But these norms don't take into account the complexity of the human experience. They don't account for the fact that what works for one person might not work for another. Philosophers have long debated the tension between individual freedom and societal expectations. One idea that has emerged from this debate is the concept of authenticity, the idea that true fulfillment comes from living in a way that reflects your inner self rather than simply following the crowd. This is where we find true liberation, when we stop comparing ourselves to others and start embracing who we really are. We begin to experience life in a more genuine and fulfilling way. And this applies directly to sexuality. If we look at ourselves honestly, without the filters of societal pressure or expectations, we might find that our relationship with sexuality is much simpler and less consuming than we thought. As I mentioned earlier, for most people, sexuality is a small part of their lives, and they don't need it to define their identity or their sense of worth. But because society has made such a big deal out of it, we often feel like we need to think about it more than is actually necessary. Here's an important idea to reflect on. When we stop trying to live up to societal standards, we realize that we are already enough. There's no need to force ourselves into categories or labels. There's no need to act in ways that don't resonate with who we really are. And once we understand this, we can start to focus on what truly matters, living in a way that brings us peace, joy, and fulfillment, rather than chasing after society's ever-changing definitions of success or normalcy. In philosophy, there's a concept known as existential freedom. It's the idea that we are all responsible for creating meaning in our own lives. No one else can define what your life should be about. Only you can do that. And the same goes for sexuality. It's up to each of us to determine what role it plays in our lives, if any. We don't need to look to others to tell us what's right or wrong for us. We have the power to choose, to create our own understanding of our desires, and to live in a way that aligns with our personal truth. This might sound difficult, especially in a world that constantly tells us what we should be doing, but it's one of the most freeing realizations we can have. We don't owe society our conformity. We don't have to meet anyone's expectations except our own. Once we internalize this, we can start living more authentically, not just in terms of sexuality, but in every aspect of our lives. So, here's the challenge I want to leave you with. Take a step back from the societal noise. Reflect on what truly matters to you. Ask yourself, are you living in a way that reflects your inner truth? Or are you living according to someone else's standards? When it comes to sexuality, or any other part of life, what do you truly need and want? Is it aligned with who you are, or are you trying to meet external expectations? In conclusion, authenticity is the key to freedom. When we embrace who we truly are and stop trying to conform to societal norms, we find a deeper sense of fulfillment. Sexuality is just one part of life, and it doesn't need to be bigger than it is. The journey towards spiritual and personal growth comes from within, from understanding and accepting ourselves, rather than following what society dictates. True liberation lies in the ability to live as your authentic self, free from the need to fit into someone else's version of what your life should be. Now that we've talked about breaking free from societal expectations and embracing our individual truths, let's take this discussion even further. We've touched on the fact that sexuality is a natural part of our existence, and that rather than letting society dictate its place in our lives, we need to define it for ourselves. But there's another layer to this that we haven't yet explored in depth: the role of awareness in transforming our natural instincts, including sexuality. So let me start by asking you all a question. What does it mean to be aware? Think about it for a moment. In our day-to-day lives, how often are we truly conscious of our actions, our thoughts, and our desires? And more importantly, how often do we act out of habit or instinct, without really understanding the deeper motivations behind what we do. We've already established that sexuality is a biological function, a part of human nature that exists for the survival of the species. But here's where philosophy comes in. Is it enough to simply act on our natural instincts, or should we seek to bring a higher level of consciousness to them? When we talk about awareness, we're not just talking about the ability to recognize what's happening around us. True awareness is much deeper than that. It's about understanding the underlying motivations that drive our actions and consciously deciding how we want to respond. And this is where transformation begins. Let's apply this to sexuality. For most people, sexuality operates at the level of instinct. It's a natural drive, and there's nothing wrong with that. But here's the philosophical question. Should we allow our instincts to govern us, or should we aim to rise above them, using our awareness to guide how we engage with these natural drives? At the core of many philosophical traditions is the idea that human beings are capable of transcending their basic instincts. We are not just animals bound by our biology. We have the capacity for self-reflection, for mindfulness, and for growth. And it's this capacity that allows us to transform the way we relate to the natural world, including our own bodies and instincts. This doesn't mean suppressing or denying our natural drives. In fact, denial often leads to more harm than good. But it does mean approaching our instincts with conscious awareness. Rather than letting sexuality control us, we can choose to engage with it in a way that aligns with our higher values and goals. We can decide how much space it takes up in our lives and how we want to express it in a way that feels authentic and fulfilling. Here's a philosophical perspective that's worth considering. In the act of becoming aware, we take control of our own lives. Without awareness, we are like leaves in the wind, tossed around by our instincts and external influences. But with awareness, we become the architects of our own existence. We gain the power to choose how we want to live, rather than simply reacting to the forces around us. In this context, sexuality is just one of many natural instincts that we can bring under the light of awareness. By doing so, we prevent it from becoming an overwhelming force in our lives. We recognize it for what it is, a natural part of our biology, but we don't let it define us or dominate our consciousness. This is where we begin to see the transformative power of awareness. By consciously engaging with our instincts, we can elevate our experience of life. Instead of being driven by base urges, we can make decisions that reflect our true values and desires. We move from reacting to life to actively shaping it. And this is true not just for sexuality, but for all aspects of human experience. Let's take a broader philosophical view for a moment. Many spiritual and philosophical traditions teach that the path to wisdom lies in self-awareness. When we are aware, we can recognize the difference between what is essential and what is not. We can distinguish between our true needs and the fleeting desires that often distract us. And in doing so, we gain a sense of peace and clarity that allows us to live more fully in the present moment. This idea of conscious transformation is central to many philosophies of self-mastery. The ancient Stoics, for instance, believed that human beings should strive to live in accordance with nature, but not be ruled by it. They taught that while we cannot always control what happens to us, we can control how we respond. And this response should be guided by reason and virtue, rather than by unchecked emotion or instinct. In a similar way, we have the power to transform our natural instincts by bringing them into alignment with our higher values. When it comes to sexuality, this means recognizing its place in our lives, but not letting it overwhelm us. It means understanding that while it is a natural drive, it doesn't need to dominate our thoughts or actions. And most importantly, it means approaching it with awareness, deciding consciously how we want to engage with it, rather than letting it operate unconsciously in the background. Here's another important point to consider. Awareness doesn't just help us manage our instincts. It opens the door to deeper experiences of life. When we bring awareness to our actions, we start to see the interconnectedness of all things. We realize that every part of our life, from the most mundane tasks to the most profound experiences, is an opportunity for growth and understanding. We begin to see life as a continuous process of learning and transformation. So, as we continue to reflect on the role of sexuality in our lives, let's remember that the goal isn't to deny or suppress it, but to approach it with awareness. Awareness gives us the freedom to make conscious choices, to decide how we want to live, rather than being pulled along by instinct or external pressures. And this is the path to true freedom. In conclusion, what I want you to take away from this discussion is the idea that awareness is the key to transforming our natural instincts into opportunities for growth. Whether we're talking about sexuality or any other part of life, the power of awareness lies in its ability to help us rise above instinct and choose a path that is aligned with our highest values. In awareness, we find freedom, and in freedom, we find the potential for true transformation. As we conclude our exploration today, let's take a moment to reflect on the key themes we discussed. We began by recognizing sexuality as a natural part of our existence, separate from societal expectations. We acknowledged that while sexuality can be a significant aspect of life, it does not define us, nor does it need to be a spiritual pursuit. Then we ventured into the realm of societal influences, challenging the norms that often dictate our behaviors and desires. By understanding that we do not need to conform to external standards, we empowered ourselves to embrace our individual truths. Finally, we discussed the transformative power of conscious awareness. By being mindful of our instincts and choices, we gain the freedom to shape our lives in a way that reflects our authentic selves, rather than being driven by external pressures. In closing, I encourage each of you to carry these insights with you. Let us strive to live authentically, embrace our natural instincts with awareness, and break free from societal constraints. By doing so, we not only enrich our own lives, but also contribute to a more accepting and understanding world for everyone. Thank you for being here today and for engaging in this vital conversation. Thank you.